What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one I'm going to discuss Wildcard 12. So I've got the main draft to go through, an alternative draft as well, because I think there's a big decision to be made if you're using the wildcard this week. Then I'm going to answer some of your questions too. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Let's get into it. Okay, let's start with the defensive players. Now I know some people aren't going to like this given the recent returns and lack of clean sheets. But if I was wildcarding in Gameweek 12 ahead of Arsenal's good fixture run, I would double up on their defence. And I think I would go for Raya and Gabriel, which is basically the combination I've got in my own team. You could go for Gabriel and a second defender, possibly a Saliba for absolute safety, maybe Timber, who's a little bit cheaper. But I just think right now, Raya is close to a price drop. Gabriel dropped in price, I think, last night or the night before. People are selling their Arsenal defensive assets right before the fixtures get good. For me, that is a little bit of an edge for Wildcard 12 to ignore the lack of clean sheets and just back one of the best defences in the league, right? I think it's fairly straightforward at the moment that Arsenal and Liverpool are the two best defences in the league, with City probably in third. But the way they're playing at the moment, no one really wants to back them for a clean sheet. So I think given the fixtures, that's exactly what I would do. Forest at home this week. Yes, decent team, right? But they only scored one past Newcastle at home. Arsenal at home are brilliant. West Ham away, Man United at home, Fulham away, Everton at home. The fixtures are just good for a very long time, and they're just set and forget. At the absolute minimum, I would have one Arsenal defensive option, and it would probably be Gabriel because of the goal threat. And if you wanted to go for a different keeper, you can maybe pick someone cheap like Verbruggen instead for Brighton, who have got decent fixtures coming up as well. If I went for Verbruggen, I wouldn't also go for Van Heck, who I've got on the bench, but you could obviously just swap him to a different cheap defender. But Raya and Gabriel would definitely be in for me. And there's no debate about who the cheap goalkeeper should be on the bench. It's got to be Fabianski, right? Because he's in that West Ham team at the moment. Will that continue forever? Not necessarily. But there's no other playing 4 million goalkeeper, so it's just obvious to go for him. I've also included Konate because, well, as I've just mentioned, right, Liverpool defence is pretty good. Trent, we don't know whether he's going to be fit. And I think if I was wildcard, I wouldn't spend that money on Trent. And I know I've said for a long time now that I want to keep him for my own team, but the decision when you have a player versus you're buying a player versus you're wildcarding is always a little bit different. So if I was on wildcard, I wouldn't go for Trent, but I've put Konate in. I think Liverpool's fixtures are decent enough, right? Southampton away is good, City at home is not great, and Newcastle away in 14 isn't amazing either. But after that, they have got a lot of fixtures where you wouldn't mind playing a Liverpool defender. So Everton away in 15, Fulham at home in 16, Leicester at home in 18, West Ham away in 19. The list goes on and on. If you've got more money to spend, or there's a downgrade somewhere else you're willing to make, possibly you don't want to go for Ray, you're going to go for Verbruggen instead, I would be tempted to go for Van Dijk for absolute security. It's fairly obvious, right, that Konate is pretty nailed at the moment. But I think you've got zero worries with Van Dijk, maybe ever so slight worries with Konate, especially around injuries and stuff like that. But right now, he looks really good value. And the other problem is, I think Van Dijk went up in price last night. He's now 6.3. It's almost getting to the point now where I really like him as an option because he's so consistent, but he's getting quite expensive. So Konate's in. And then basically, like with every wild card you're ever going to play, you're then just working out which cheap defenders to go for. Now, I've gone for Anderson and playing him this week from Fulham, who's got Wolves at home. I know a lot of people have just bought Strand, Larson, Cunha, etc. But I think on paper that's a pretty good fixture, and Fulham are playing pretty well this year. After the Wolves at home game, the fixtures are pretty terrible for a little while for Fulham. They've got Spurs away in 13, then it's Brighton at home, Arsenal at home, Liverpool away. So you're going to play, if you go for Anderson, you're probably going to play him this week and then not playing for 4 game weeks afterwards. But the beauty of being on wildcard is you can have other cheap defenders that rotate nicely. And most weeks you're going to play Gabriel and Konate anyway, so you only need one more cheap defender. And once you get past those, once you get past game weeks 13 to 16 for Fulham, the fixtures then get really good. They've got lots of playable fixtures. Southampton at home in 17, Bournemouth at home in 19. Look, that's not an easy fixture, but if you had to play Anderson in that game, you wouldn't be worried. Ipswich at home in 20, West Ham away in 21, Leicester away in 22, and he's only 4.3 million. I just wouldn't pay 4.7 for Robinson when you can get Anderson for 4.3. So that's why he's in. I've gone for 8 Nuri, mostly because I think a lot of people wildcard and will probably already have him. So they probably picked him up at 4.4 or 4.5 million. If I was wildcarding, I'd basically be picking 8 Nuri up for 4.7. I'm not sure if I was actually wildcarding whether I would go for him. I think he's super attacking and he's a fun player to own in FPL. And I might buy him soon. So I don't want to make it out like I think he's this terrible option because he's not. But apart from Ipswich at home in 16 and Leicester away in 17, I'm not convinced about clean sheets for Wolves whatsoever. And he's super attacking, so the attacking returns will definitely be there at some point. But the bread and butter for a defender is the clean sheets. And I'm just not convinced they get very many because that Wolves defence is just not great. I mean, Fulham away, Bournemouth at home, Everton away, West Ham away, next 4. Like, it's possible they could pick up 1 or 2. But I also think it's quite unlikely. So I've put 8 Nuri in because I think a lot of people got him cheaper. But I'm not sure about him at 4.7. I think basically the summary of that pick for me would be, if you need to downgrade someone to get funds for another player, and you really want that other player, I wouldn't mind downgrading 8 Nuri to like a Lewis Hall or someone like that who's 4.3. He's someone else that you could consider as well. So decent pick. Absolutely, and I think a lot of people will want to go for him, which is why I included him. But I don't think he's absolutely essential on wildcard. And then I've picked Van Heck, who's 4.5 million, because Brighton's fixtures coming up are great. It's another reason that I would look at Verbruggen if you don't want Raya. If Lewis Dunk is past fit, he's only 4.4, so he's a bit cheaper, and he may well drop to 4.3. If that happens and he's fit, he's an absolute bargain. And Bournemouth away in 12 is not great. But then after that, again, they've got a lot of playable fixtures. So Southampton at home in 13, Leicester away in 15, Palace at home in 16. You know, even like West Ham away 17, Brentford at home in 18, pretty good. Then you get a few tougher fixtures, Villa away, Arsenal at home, but you can bench him for them. Then straight away you've got Ipswich away 21, Everton at home 23, and the fixtures just continue to be pretty good for a while. So I think a Brighton defender looks great. I would definitely have double Arsenal defence. I like Konate, although I wouldn't be completely tied to him. Again, if you needed to downgrade a player for another move elsewhere, you could just put him down to like Colwell or someone like that. Like that would save you 0.8 million straight away. That could be a big upgrade somewhere else. So I think the only 3 players that I would be for the defence, the only players I'd be almost certain I would have in my wildcard team if I was playing it this week are Raya, Gabriel, probably Anderson because of how cheap he is, and Fabianski. I think everyone else is up for discussion, but basically you're just fitting in your favourite cheap defenders. Lewis Hall, Dunk, Colwell, all players that could be considered, but I've gone for Anderson, 8 Nuri and Van Heck right now, just because Van Heck's fit and Dunk isn't. So apart from maybe double Arsenal defence, the easiest part of this wildcard to pick was the midfield, because most of these players just pick themselves at the moment. If Palmer and Saka are fully fit and available for game week 12, nearly everybody that's wildcarding this week will go Salah, Palmer, Saka as 3 of their 5 midfield picks. And there's really no good, strong argument to back against that. I know some people just like going different for the sake of it. They might want to keep hold of Haaland. That's absolutely fine. But Salah, Palmer, Saka just looks very strong right now. I've said for my own team over the last couple of weeks that if it gets to a stage in game weeks 12, 13, 14 where I've got other issues to deal with and I can't get to Saka, then I don't feel a pressure to buy him. And I still stand by that. But that's mostly because for captaincy, the Salah-Palmer rotation is so good. And I don't think for quite a few weeks we're going to be looking at Saka captain. But that's a transfer decision. If I was wildcarding this week, he'd absolutely be in my team. Now, he is yellow flagged at the moment. And Arteta said that it doesn't look good. But I think that's always the case with Saka. And obviously they're going to want him off international duty as well over the break. I'm sure he'll be fine for game week 12. If he's not, it does open up an interesting discussion about who to go for instead. You could just go straight for Son, have him for that City away game, then the good fixtures afterwards. Or you could just go for Mbeumo because he's not in this draft, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Cole Palmer, like I said, just a great option going forward. Salah is as well. I've put Bruno Fernandes in. I think for the first time this season, I can put him in a video and I won't get too much flack for it. I don't think he's essential or anything like that. I know I've joked around that a little bit, but it does feel like a pretty nice time to jump on him if you don't have him already. Like Ipswich away right in front of you. It's Everton at home straight after that. And don't get me wrong, in game week 14 it's Arsenal away, in 16 it's City away. But outside of that, the fixtures are pretty good for quite a while. And I think there's a question later on Man United players. Lots of discussion around how Amorim will set up. However he sets up, Bruno Fernandes will be in that team. No doubts about that whatsoever. And we're coming into a period of the season where there's a few extra fixtures. There's going to be injury suspensions. And I've said this before, the one player you can pretty much count on to not get injured and play every game for 90 minutes is Bruno Fernandes. And I think when you're on wildcard and you can just stick him in and leave him in, I feel like that's probably too good to turn down. Now, you could just put him in for 12 and 13, see how Amorim sets up, and then look to get rid of him in Game Week 14. I think that's fine as well. But I like him as a pick because if you get to Game Week 14, there's other issues to deal with. Bruno Fernandes is never going to be a major problem because he's always going to play. You never have to check that team sheet or anything like that. So I would go for him over Mbeumo if it's a choice between the two. I do have an alternative draft in a minute that has Mbeumo as well. I just don't think I would put him in instead of any of those 4 players. If you've got the cash to put him in instead of Rodgers, who's on the bench, then absolutely you should do that. But I think it's getting... Basically, I don't want to contradict myself because I've said quite a few times as an owner of Mbeumo, I'm in no rush to sell him, and that is true. But the decision is different on the wild card because after the next couple, which is Everton away and Leicester at home, the fixtures do get a little bit tougher for Brentford. In the same way for Man United, right? They've got Ipswich away, Everton at home, then you've got a few tougher fixtures. But if I had to hold one of Mbeumo or Fernandes long term, it's going to be Fernandes. Because 19 to 22 for Brentford, you've got Arsenal at home, City at home, and Liverpool at home. And before that, it's like Brighton away, Chelsea away, Newcastle at home, Villa away. The fixtures get tougher. So if I've got to have a cheap midfielder on the bench, Mbeumo's the midfielder that I'm letting go of, as long as Saka and Palmer are both fit, which I'm sure they will be. On Rodgers, he's simply in because I got him at 5 million. If you're having to pay a bit extra for him, you might want to go up to like a Smith Rowe or a Sememyo, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. Likewise, you could sell Konate down to a Colwill or a Lewis Hall or someone like that and free up nearly $1 million, and that could also give you the opportunity to do Rodgers up to someone more expensive like a Sememyo. The only thing I would say is, you're on wildcard, there's a temptation to distribute all your money around. In some ways, it's quite nice just to have a few cheap spots like Rodgers. So when the time comes that you do need to shift money to maybe a Haaland or someone like that, you've got less transfers to have to make rather than having your money spread around. But either way, you can choose a different cheap midfielder. I wouldn't say Rodgers is essential. And I do think he's going to get early subs over December because he has played a lot and Unai Emery has mentioned that he is quite tired. And then up front, I've got Alexander Isak, Raul Jimenez and João Pedro. Now, with that Isak spot, there's going to be questions about whether or not you should go for an alternative instead. So you've got Dominic Solanke, Nicholas Jackson, Ollie Watkins and Kai Havertz as well. Now, for the way I've set this squad up, I've got triple Arsenal already. So double defence and Saka. So Kai Havertz can be discounted straight away. I think in isolation, Havertz is a good option because of the fixture swing for Arsenal. But I wouldn't sell one of those Arsenal players just to fit him in. So he's not an option for me. I think with Solanke, I like the fact he's a little bit cheaper than the other players I've mentioned. But you are walking into Man City away. It just doesn't feel right to wildcard and keep him. And I just think Isak's a bit of a differential right now at the time that Newcastle's fixtures get a lot better. And Spurs fixtures aren't bad after City away, but they're not so good that you should go for Solanke over Isak, in my opinion. If you've got the money, he's the one to go for. It's Palace away in 13. Liverpool at home in 14 is probably their toughest game for quite a while. Then it's Brentford away, Leicester at home, Ipswich away. That run just looks really good. Like, I'm even tempted to take a hit and bring him in for my own team. I don't think I'll do that, but it is a little bit of a tempter. So Isak would be the one for me. I think with Watkins, I just think he's too expensive. And I feel like FPL priced him that high for good reason based on what he did last year. But I think in the context of all the other players we can pick from at the moment, 9 million for Watkins just doesn't feel like great value, even though the fixtures coming up are pretty good. Like, they've got Palace at home, Brentford at home and Southampton at home, 3 in the next 4. They also have Chelsea away in 13, Forest away 16, City at home in 17. Like, City doesn't feel like a bad fixture right now, but it's still not amazing or anything like that. So I think I would ignore Watkins. And then we spoke quite a lot last night on the stream about Nicholas Jackson. I just find Chelsea, not Leicester here. He's a good option, right, when he's playing, which he will do because he's nailed on for that number 9 spot. But he is on 4 yellow cards. And I know what some people were saying, that once he gets that yellow card, that's his rest done. And at least you know the week it's going to happen. For other players, they might get they might get a rest and you might not know what week that is in. I get that. But also, if he picks up a yellow card against Leicester, misses Villa, or picks up a yellow card against Villa and misses Southampton, that's just extremely frustrating. You don't have that concern for Isak. And I can't sit here and guarantee you that Isak will play every game for 90 minutes over this congested period. But Wilson's still out at the moment. Like, he's red flagged, expected back soon, but he's already had a setback. He's not played for a while. Like, Isak's well ahead of him when it comes to that number 9 spot. So I just don't get why you would take the risk with the 4 yellow cards when you're on a wild card. If you've got Jackson already in your team and you're not wildcarding, of course you just keep him, right? It's an easy decision. But you're on wildcard, so you can make better decisions, I guess. So Isak would be in. Raul Jimenez, okay, let me start with João Pedro, right? He's 5.4 million. He's definitely going to go up in price during the international break. There's going to be questions of, is he definitely going to play against Bournemouth? What will his minutes be like going forward? Nobody can guarantee you that João Pedro is absolutely nailed, but he has played 25 minutes and probably a bit of extra time as well off the back of being out for quite a while. Hertzler's been talking him up again, praising him for his leadership and how he's one of their best players and stuff like that. The first 3 game weeks when he was fit, it was 81, 90 and 90 minutes, to the point where, if we remember, Danny Welbeck was coming off and João Pedro was moving into that number 9 spot. He's almost certainly still first choice penalty taker. The fixtures coming up are great. Again, on wildcard, it's just too good to turn down. So once you've got João Pedro and you have to go for another cheap forward, I think it's got to be Raul Jimenez. If you've got the money to go up to Cunha and you want to keep him, or you want to downgrade someone else to get Cunha, absolutely fine. But I don't think he's essential. Like, lots of people brought him in last week because you got Southampton at home, right? And he's absolutely nailed on. You've got Ipswich and Leicester to come later on in 16 and 17. That is great. But if I was wildcarding this week, I just wouldn't pick him because he's 6.7 million. And I want that midfield, and I kind of want Isak, and there has to be sacrifices somewhere else. So if it's Raul Jimenez versus Strand Larsen, I think I'm going Raul Jimenez in a stronger Fulham team. Strand Larsen, nothing wrong with him. You could argue the fixtures in the short term are a bit better. But if Raul Jimenez keeps his place, as I mentioned with Anderson, the fixtures long term are good. And also, Fulham's fixtures are probably a bit better for an attacker than they are a defender. Like Spurs away in 13, you're not going to be massively worried about that. Brighton at home in 14 is not terrible. Arsenal at home 15, Liverpool away in 16, not great. But because you're wildcard and you've got a squad full of fit players, hopefully, that are always going to play, you can always rotate Raul Jimenez out, and then the fixtures afterwards are pretty good. So I really like the look of that. Let's take a quick look at the alternative draft. So basically, there's only 2 changes for the alternative draft, but I think for people wildcarding this week, this is one of the big decisions that you're going to have to make. So instead of Isak and Rodgers, I've gone for Evan Nielsen and Mbeumo. Now, Evan Nielsen could be any cheap forward, right? Cunha, Strand Larsen, Visser. You might even want to go for Welbeck, double up with João Pedro. You can pick who you want. Depends how much money you've got to spend on that spot. But basically, you're putting someone cheap in there instead of Isak to have Mbeumo in your midfield alongside Salah, Palmer, Saka and Fernandes. On paper, that midfield looks great. That's a power 5 midfield. When they're fit and available, each one of those players is absolutely nailed to play 80 to 90 minutes pretty much every single game. And they're all on penalties as well. And I think most people, if they could, would have that midfield from this week onwards. It might be that in a couple of game weeks' time, FPL has changed again and we don't want that midfield, but it's going to hold up well for a long time. The sacrifice you have to make is Isak out, or basically not having like an Isak, Havertz, Jackson type forward. Maybe you could put one of them in by making sacrifices elsewhere, like Raya and Gabriel out, maybe Dunk instead of Van Heck, Lewis Hall instead of Aït-Nouri, etc. I'll have a look at that in a minute, but I think for me it would just be Isak out. Now, in theory, this could work really nicely. I think the cheap forwards offer a lot of value, the likes of Raul Jimenez, Evan Nielsen, João Pedro. My one concern would be you're always 3 transfers away from getting Haaland. And right now, lots of people don't want Haaland, and it might be a while until we need him again. But if someone was to get injured in that midfield, like Salah or Palmer or Saka, it's going to take you 3 moves to shift those funds to Haaland. Now, in the meantime, you might have racked up a load of points, so you don't really care. And because you're on a wild card, and you've set your squad up so well, hopefully you can roll transfers over the next few weeks. But I would just keep it in mind. So I've set this draft up here. Let's just say Salah was to get injured and you want to upgrade one of your forwards. It would probably be Evan Nielsen because he's the most expensive of the 3 that I've picked. And you need to go to Haaland. if I put him in, then take Salah out, I've only got 3.7 to spend. So I have to downgrade someone else as well to get Haaland in. Now, it might be that Salah gets injured, you just move to Son and you don't worry about Haaland, you're happy with captaining other players. It's just something to keep in mind. When you've got someone like Isak there, you've got a much quicker route back to Haaland. So for my own team, for example, if Salah gets injured, I've got Solanke up to Haaland. Salah can just go to a 6.9 million midfielder. I can do it in 2 moves. So that would be the main concern for me. I think it's hard to let Sememyo go because he's been such good value. And if you got him cheap, even with the bad fixtures, you probably don't want to sell him. In that case, I would probably just give up Isak. But I think if we're talking strictly points going forward, I think Isak and the cheaper midfielder is possibly more likely to outscore Sememyo. Although I don't know that, to be honest. I'm not completely convinced about that. Because I do think the fixtures are not as bad as they look for Brentford. And also Mbeumo's cheaper than Isak. Even if you're buying new, he's cheaper. And I think like an Evan-Nielsen or a Visser stands up really well to a Sememyo or Rodgers. I really like this. Like, part of me is like getting a bit of a nostalgia hit. There's periods before as we've come into Christmas where we've had power 5 midfields with I can't remember exactly who was in there, but players like Van der Vaart and Bale and then like 3 others as well. People will probably have better memories than me. There's something about a midfield like that just feels right. And the forwards are all such good value potentially. Like Evan-Nielsen often gets subbed early. He has missed 1 game. Raul Jimenez gets subbed early. We don't quite know the full fitness of João Pedro. But if they get enough minutes, they're such good value. I think arguably that is a better draft than the Isak one. But Isak's such a nice differential right now. I don't know if I'd want to give that up. Either way, that's one of your decisions. I think in general, Salah, Palmer, Saka, Fernandes, Gabriel, Raya, they are 6 of your players that you're going to play every single week. And I think they're so obvious to pick. I think João Pedro is as well. So is Fabianski. That's 8 players out of 15 that for me are pretty much no-brainers. I'm not saying Fernandes is essential. You can go without him. But I would definitely put him on right now. I think that looks great. Let's answer some of your questions. So just quickly before I go through the questions, I thought I would have a quick tinker with that alternative draft I just spoke about, just to see if it was possible to have that midfield 5 with an Isak up front as well. I don't think it is, but if I do Evan-Nielsen back to Isak, I've basically got to free up 2.3 million. I think this is going to be pretty difficult. So let's say that Van Heck goes to Dunk, because he's a little bit cheaper, and we hope that Dunk is fully fit. Aitnery would have to come out for, I guess, someone like Lewis Hall, because he's 4.3 still. I'd be surprised if he doesn't go up in price soon. And then Konate also out. See, I'd only have 3.5 to spend, so Raya would also have to come out as well. Like, even if I went from Konate to Colwill, it still leaves me $1 million to find. It's just too tight, I think. I just wouldn't want to give up Raya or Gabriel. I guess you could go from Isak to, like, Solanke instead, but I'd still be 0.2 million off. Like, you might have bought some of these players cheaper, right? If you got Palmer at 10.5 million, for example, you can probably afford this draft with Solanke as well. And at least that gives you a better route to go back to Haaland if you need to. So something like that could be quite tempting. So basically I've done Aitnery, Konate and Van Heck to Lewis Hall, Colwill and Dunk. I'm still 0.2 million off though. But like I said, you might have got some of these players cheaper than I did. Yeah, I just don't know if Solanke is necessarily worth it. I think I'd rather just go for a cheaper forward and upgrade these positions. I do like the idea of having Konate, like Liverpool, cover. And I know Aitnery, people just don't want to drop him. I mean, if you got Aitnery at 4.4, you could keep him in instead of Colwill. That's 0.1 back. Anyway, I've talked about that draft enough. If you can, try and have like a Solanke or Isak up front. But I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. So let's answer some of your questions. Should we be avoiding Man United players until we have seen a few games of Amorim ball and how he lines up? I think the answer is yes, with the exception of Bruno Fernandes. Because no matter what formation and setup Amorim goes for, Bruno Fernandes will be in that team. And I'd be very surprised if he's not still a 90-minute man every single week. He's still going to take penalties as well. He has to be in. He's Man United's best attacker. He's not suddenly going to get dropped or anything like that. You could make a case that there's a risk Fernandes could play a little bit deeper in Amorim's system if he goes for the back 3. So he could play alongside like an Ugarte in midfield, and then you might have a front 3 of like Højlund, Garnacho or Rashford or something like that. I'd be surprised if that's what happens. If he goes for this back three setup with 2 players behind Højlund, surely Fernandes is one of those players. Threading balls through to your number 9, no one can do that better in the team than Bruno Fernandes. So I think he's a good option to go for, as I've already mentioned. The rest of them I think you can ignore. Like Højlund, for example, is potentially a really good price. But the biggest factor for me is Arsenal away in 14 and City away in 16. I just don't think any other Man United players is necessarily worth the risk, because you just don't know how they're going to set up. We can talk for hours and hours about the back three, which players fit in. Amrin might go for something different or favour certain players. And with Arsenal and City coming up as 2 of the next 5 game weeks, I just don't think it's worth the risk. There's cheaper forwards that are just as good, if not better, than Højlund. I think with Garnacho, you've just seen him bench in the last game. There's no guarantee that he starts. Same with Rashford. And Rashford's been poor for a while. Maybe he'll thrive in this system, but there's no guarantee. He's been subbed before the 60th minute, 2 of the last 3. Again, that might not continue under a new manager. We just don't know. Dallow's just come off before 60 as well. Mazraoui's potentially a bargain at 4.6. Would he definitely be in the team? I don't know, right? And even with Onana, don't mind him at 5.1, but I'm definitely spending a little bit more money and getting Raya instead. So, I don't know. De Ligt is probably nailed. I'd be very surprised if there's a back 3 and De Ligt's not in it. But also he's 5 million. For 0.3 more, you can go and get Konate. So, I'd love to sit here and recommend Man United players, but apart from Bruno Fernandes, I'm not sure I'd put any of the others in, despite Ipswich away this week. I just think the fixtures afterwards just don't make it worth the risk. And there's lots of good alternatives. So let's move to the other side of Manchester. Would you include any Man City players on Wildcard 12? Now, you've already seen the drafts, of course, and I didn't have any Man City players included. But let's talk about it a little bit more. I don't think anyone can come up with an argument to convince me to put Man City players on Wildcard 12. I just don't think there's any reason. Like, even with Rico Lewis, I can see that potentially in the future, he will still be a really good value player. Like, getting a Man City defender for 4.9 million that's getting as many minutes as Rico Lewis doesn't happen that often. But as we've seen recently, 4 losses in a row, Man City are conceding. Rodri is a big miss. It's just not working great. They've got injuries in defence as well. I don't see a clean sheet against Spurs or Liverpool. And yes, 14 onwards, the fixtures get much better. But every week, you're going to be a little bit unsure about whether Rico Lewis plays. And again, I'll reiterate, he's played a lot of minutes. I think he will continue starting a lot of games, but not all of them. And you can get defenders that are cheaper, that have got good fixtures, where you just don't have that headache. Like Van Heck, Anderson, etc. absolutely nailed. So Rico Lewis wouldn't be in for me. Vardio I don't hate because he's got a bit of goal threat. But again, I don't see many clean sheets coming up, and he's 6.3 million. If we were talking about wildcard 14, when they've got Forest at home, Palace away, Man United at home, Villa away, Everton at home, Leicester away, right in front of them, maybe. But who would I downgrade in this team to put him in? There's not many players right now I would consider doing that for. Then you've got the midfielders in Foden and De Bruyne. And look, we shouldn't go too far the opposite way on Man City. It's fair enough right now to say that they're not at their best and they're not as scary to play as they usually would be. They're also not terrible. Pep Guardiola will figure this out. Players like Foden and De Bruyne, when they're playing, will get returns. I just don't... Terrible value is a bit harsh, but I just don't think they're value whatsoever. Kevin De Bruyne, I've got no confidence that he will stay fit or play all the games over December. I just don't think that will happen. So what's the point in spending 9.4 million? And as I've said on every Final Thoughts video for the last 4 weeks or so, Foden's 9.2. Like, you look at that power 5 midfielders, I've called it. Who comes out for Foden? I would much rather have Bruno Fernandes right now. And that's not a knee-jerk over the last 2 weeks. I said that a couple of weeks ago, before Fernandes got double-digit hauls 2 games in a row. I'd rather have him. He's absolutely nailed. He's on penalties. That is not the case for Foden. And look, Foden's played 390 minutes in a row. De Bruyne is not fit. Foden will keep starting, right? He can play on the right. He can play centrally. He'll get really good minutes over December. He's one of the players that Pep can rely on to be fit. Where do you put him in? Like, even if you wanted to go Fernandes to Foden or Mbeumo to Foden, you've then got to find even more money. It just doesn't work for me. And then Haaland, we're going with premium midfielders instead right now. Again, we shouldn't pretend that Haaland is finished and he's going to stop scoring. He literally just scored against Brighton. Who knows? He doesn't get a yellow card. Maybe he gets a few bonus points as well. The score looks better. I just think, and this is why I sold him in game week 10, there's no fixtures until maybe 18 or 19 where he's by far the best captain. There will be weeks where he's great, like game week 12, for example, against that Spurs defence. But then you've got Palmer against Leicester, Salah against Southampton. There's always an alternative. Even, and I've said this before, game week 18, Everton at home for Haaland. Salah's got Leicester at home. Game week 19, Leicester away for Haaland. Palmer's got Ipswich away. As long as those midfielders stay fit, he's great. Absolutely, try and keep yourself a route open to get Haaland in or start building up transfers so you can do it. I just wouldn't include him right now, and I don't think many people would. So my premiums are all okay. Is it worth playing the wild card just to tinker around the edges, or is it better to hold until a real crisis unfolds? Ultimately, it could be played the week before it expires, allowing a later second wild card. Simple answer, if you don't need to wild card, don't feel like you have to do it, especially if you've got a lot of those key players I've talked about already in place. Like if you look at my team, I don't have my wild card available, and I've got some issues in my team like Lewis, Trent, Greaves, etc. I don't have Saka. I've got Solanke instead of Isak. But if I had my wild card, maybe I'd be using it this week, but I don't feel like I would need to use it. I've already got double Arsenal defence in place. I've got Fernandes, Salah, Palmer and Burmo. The only midfielder I'm missing that I really want is Saka. Solanke's good after this week. Rodgers can be played instead of him. I'd love João Pedro instead of Strand Larsen, but these are not reasons alone to pop the wild card. If you're in a similar position, you can absolutely save it. And it might be that you manage your team so well over the next few weeks that you get to those final couple of game weeks before the first wild card expires and you don't really need it. But also, as you said, there might be a bit of a crisis. A few players could get injured all at once and suddenly you're in a really strong position and you can go and get Haaland back as well if you need him. Because again, things change quickly in FPL. I know right now, if you haven't sold Haaland, you're thinking about it. Lots of people have already sold him. It might be by 17, 18, 19 you really want him back. Like, just remember that after the first 5 game weeks, people were talking about Haaland as a season keeper. They couldn't believe that people were going without him. All of a sudden, it now looks not crazy to own him, but it doesn't look great. That will change again, I promise you. So being in a position that maybe Saka and Salah or Saka and Palmer both pick up injuries in the same week, you can quickly shift the funds around and get Haaland. That's nice. So if you've got lots of the key players, don't feel like you need to panic wildcard, especially if it's just changing cheap defenders around and stuff like that. So which cheap midfielder would you go for? Smith Rowe, who's in form, Sememyo, who's got the fixtures, or Rodgers, who's a bit of both? Now, personally, form doesn't really play a major part in decisions that I make because ultimately it can come and go, right? So Smith Rowe's done well over the last 3 game weeks in particular. 1 goal against Palace, came close to another one assist against Everton as well. But it wasn't that long ago people were thinking about selling him because he's blanked a few times. Ultimately, Smith Rowe, Sememyo and Rodgers, we know they're all capable of attacking returns. For me, it would be more about targeting the fixtures. And I don't mind Fulham fixtures from an attacking point of view, but the fact that you have Spurs away, Arsenal at home and Liverpool away in 3 of the next 5, and you're on wildcard and you can just pick a different attacker instead, that is probably what I would do. It is a tough decision though, because 17 onwards, the Fulham fixtures are quite good, and Sememyo is on 4 yellow cards. So he's only 1 away from a suspension. But I think if I was picking one between the two, because the rest of your squad is so well set up to cope with a yellow card, I think I would pick Sememyo, because the fixtures are just good now, and they're good for quite a while. And I know that sounds a little bit contradictory because I said I wouldn't go for Jackson, but that's more of your budget being spent on Jackson versus Sememyo. And I just think for that cheap midfield spot, depending on how you're structuring your squad, they might be on the bench anyway. Like in that first draft I showed you, I had Rodgers on the bench. You could have Sememyo instead. Whereas with Jackson, you're going to want to play him every week, so it's a bit more annoying when he gets that 5th yellow. So I think I would pick Sememyo over Smith Rowe. But please don't get me wrong, Smith Rowe is a really good option. Like when you look at midfielders for total points so far, like he's in the top 6. There's nothing wrong with him whatsoever. I think in isolation, Rodgers is the worst pick of the lot because he does have European matches to play as well. He's not going to play as many 80 to 90 minutes as Smith Rowe and Sememyo, but he's also the cheapest, especially if you got him at 5 million. So that should be factored in. If you're buying new, Rodgers is 5.4. Smith Rowe is only 0.3 million more, and Sememyo is only, 0.8, I think? Let me just double check. No, he's 5.7 as well, so it's only 0.3 difference. So if you're buying new, I'd go for one of the other two. if you got Rodgers at 5 million, I'd be tempted to keep him just for budget reasons. And even if you don't need that money later on, you will at some point. I think Villa still have some pretty good fixtures to come. I mentioned tiredness earlier. Unai Emery was basically Unai Emery does not want Morgan Rodgers playing for the England under-21s. He kind of thinks that if he's not in the main team, he just shouldn't be playing. He should be getting rest instead. And we have seen quite a few early substitutions, but also he just played 90 against Liverpool. So I'd go for Sememyo, Smith Rowe, and then Rodgers. But if I got Rodgers at 5 million, I'd be very tempted just to keep him instead. If you've enjoyed that video and found it useful, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button as well. Rate 5 stars if you're listening on podcast. I'll be back tomorrow with early thoughts. I'll probably do transfer plans on Wednesday as well. After that, probably not so much content until next week. So enjoy the international break. And if you're sticking around, there's still a few more videos to come. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you tomorrow.